Hi, I'm Brett Griffiths with the University of Michigan School of Public Health Writing Lab. In this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about literature reviews, sometimes called lit reviews, what they are, how to identify them when you're reading, and some strategies that you can use when you approach writing them for yourself. This tutorial is intended to help you know what literature reviews are, what purposes they serve, and to identify literature reviews in your own reading, to understand expectations of a good literature review, and to identify some common mistakes to avoid when writing your own literature reviews. As John Swales and Christine Feeks of the University of Michigan English Language Institute explain, literature reviews tell a story about the history, and sometimes the multiple histories, of your research topic. They put multiple studies into a single conversation. They identify trends, advances, and points of consensus and dissent among scholars. Finally, they identify unanswered questions and unexplored methodologies for pursuing additional research. As a side note, Feek and Swales' book, Telling the Research Story, which is pictured here, is a great additional resource for writing your own literature reviews. There are two kinds of literature reviews: self-contained literature reviews that are complete articles and are published as such, and embedded literature review sections, which comprise one important component of an academic research article. Although these perform similar functions, these two kinds of literature reviews vary in length and in the breadth of their focus. Standalone literature reviews are article-length discussions about the literature. They offer a snapshot of the field for a selected period of time. They review and organize the history of research in a field during that time, and they identify important concepts, trends, scientific advances, and points of consensus and disagreement among researchers. They also identify unanswered research questions and possible future research agenda for the field. Embedded literature reviews, or literature review sections, appear within research articles and help to contextualize the research and offer a rationale for it. Literature review sections in papers vary in length according to the disciplinary expectations, as well as the general familiarity among scholars in the field about the subject more generally. In some papers in biostatistics, the literature review may appear within the introduction and be undifferentiated from it. It may only be a few sentences. In other disciplines, the literature review is sometimes set apart as its own section, appearing after the introduction and before the methods. This section is sometimes called the background, history, or context of the problem. Literature reviews often include the bulk of the citations of the article. The purpose of these embedded sections is to orient readers to the subject and to fill in knowledge gaps any readers may have, as well as to demonstrate your credibility as a researcher, and thus the potential credibility of your project, and to explain the relevance of your project. Why is it timely, and why is it valuable for your field? You can think of a variety of audiences for literature reviews, but first and foremost, the audience is you, the researchers and authors or co-authors involved in the study. Preparing the literature review helps you gain mastery over a specific area of content for a designated period of time. It helps you to identify points of consensus and difference in your field, and it helps you to identify research projects in your field that are relevant and appropriate, maybe even cutting edge. Don't be surprised if you're asked to work on a literature review at the beginning of a graduate student research assistantship, for example, as these will help you orient yourself to the area of research that the professor is working on. Another possible audience for your literature review includes your professors, if the review is part of a class assignment or a research assistantship, and reviewers, such as for grant proposals. For this audience, your primary goal is to establish your credibility by demonstrating your understanding of the research topic and the trajectory of that research topic over time. For these audiences, the literature review is an important textual component that helps to persuade your reader that your project or your interest is both timely and important. When writing a literature review for a research article, your audiences include other researchers and clinicians in your field and in related disciplines. You want to orient these readers to the special focus of your research and provide enough context and perspective that they can fairly and rigorously evaluate the merit of your article. You want to identify gaps or limitations in existing literature and offer a rationale for the project you describe in your article. You might be wondering at this point what I meant by telling a research story. Begin by identifying the concept. and when it first arose, or alternatively, how long it has informed the field. Identify major milestones in the life of the concept. Acknowledge key players in advancing knowledge about the concept. And then describe points of consensus and dispute among current and past researchers as these perspectives inform the research at hand. As you begin your research, you may feel a little overwhelmed by all the studies you are reading. Try to develop a system for organizing information, such as a table, an annotated bibliography, or a database. Some citation software has built-in resources for recording such information. Identify large categories of research that will help you organize your review. Keep concepts and advances linked to the authors who generated them. This will come in handy when you put the findings in conversation with one another. As you approach writing your literature review from the notes you've taken, it may be helpful to think of it in terms of other similar genres you have written. The literature review combines aspects of at least 3 other kinds of genres that you've probably written and almost certainly read: comparison contrast, analysis, and summary. A good literature review compares the methods, interventions, and results across several papers. It highlights relevant advances and setbacks in the field. It acknowledges the contributions of past and contemporary research teams working on similar research. It organizes findings into categories to make it easier for your reader to comprehend, and it distinguishes between findings and perspectives across publications. A good literature review analyzes the publications and organizes them into those categories. It begins by clearly identifying research topics reviewed and then presenting an organized discussion of categories based on topic, method, finding. The writer draws on the analysis of the publications to identify overlaps and disputes in the research. A good literature review summarizes trends and concepts. What big picture do the publications describe? How did that big picture emerge? And what unresolved questions or conflicting findings merit further research? Here's a very general model for approaching the organization of your literature review. However, note that not all literature reviews follow these sections in detail. The briefer your review, the less detail you will cover. Many literature reviews do not describe their methods. Most do so briefly in 1 to 3 sentences. The bulk of your review will categorize the results of your review and compare and contrast findings, etc. You will end your review by summarizing it and identifying what kinds of research have yet to be conducted. Now might be a good time to pause your video and download the example literature review on this website called Building an Effective Workforce, found below. The rest of the tutorial will point to textual examples from that article. Introduction. Begin your introduction by defining a focused area for discussion. In the example article included on this webpage, they indicate the review will focus on, quote, public health workforce literature, unquote. You want to select a focus that is narrow enough to describe the literature you are able to review and which relates directly to your study, if there is one. Next, describe what the current understanding is in this field. Has any systematic review been completed? Is it current? Is it relevant? If not, indicate what is lacking and offer a rationale for the usefulness of a current review or an updated review. Your example article indicates that, quote, the literature has grown, unquote, and then describes the contributions such a review can make. In the example article you have before you, you can see that the authors establish the focus of their paper in the first sentence and immediately follow it with a rationale for the review. Quote, the public health workforce literature has grown substantially in the past 25 years alongside increased interest in understanding the size and composition, training, recruitment, and retention of the public health workforce. However, no systematic assessment of the scientific merit of the workforce literature has been published to date. Systematic reviews are useful for identifying, selecting, and critically appraising literature that relates to specific research questions. This is on page S6. Notice that the authors signal to the readers that this is a literature review using the term literature and the term assessment to introduce their goals. They also indicate what focused section of research they intend to review: public health workforce literature. Although not always provided, methods are quite useful in a literature review. They describe for the reader how the writers selected the literature and the system used to review it. The methods may include keywords, publication dates, databases. The authors may have chosen to eliminate certain kinds of publications from reviews, such as editorials or book reviews, and the writers here can describe those decisions and their rationales. On page S7 of your example article, the authors offer several paragraphs describing their approaches to selecting literature for review and for organizing and categorizing that literature. They include sentences like this one, in which they describe the criteria for inclusion and information about available sources. The following criteria were used to determine reference eligibility for inclusion. 1. Peer-reviewed articles are published in a U.S. journal. Gray literature is published by a U.S. organization or governmental agency. 2. The main theme or themes of the article address public health workforce research or relate to at least one of the following workforce focus areas: size and composition, forecasting demand, effectiveness and health impact, and policy. And 3. The article focuses on the domestic workforce. In this description, the writers indicate not only what they are including, but by implication what they're not including. For example, by indicating that they're looking only at articles that focus on the domestic workforce, they're eliminating articles about workforce in other countries. Categories for analysis. Based on the publications you've reviewed, you'll want to identify for the reader the main thematic categories that existing publications include. Your example article uses a table to help demonstrate these categories to the readers, but you can also write them out in prose. So in the example article, they describe 5 major categories that they identified thematically in their reading. Articles about the effectiveness and health impact, articles that cut across these themes, articles about size and composition, articles about demand, and articles about policy. Comparison and contrast. You want to use language that signals to your reader what the overlaps and differences are in the literature. You needn't use separate sections for these comparisons. Rather, use comparative language modeled in your example on page S10 to signal these similarities and differences to your reader. Quote, "The healthcare workforce literature features quantitative methods for estimating workforce demand. For example," here they include an example of the quantitative methods for those estimations. They then give a comparison term. Quote, "Similarly, an analytic framework for determining desired characteristics of the healthcare workforce uses variables relating to health needs and provider productivity." Finally, here they're indicating that they're summarizing and concluding what many of these studies say. Boorhaus suggests, ... this sentence goes on, and finally indicate these articles provide support for. That is, what they mean to say is, having compared these different approaches, these articles provide support for a particular conclusion. Finally, a good literature identifies unanswered questions that seem relevant for the field to take on, given what literature has already been conducted, or what experiments have already been conducted. They explain how the current situation of the discipline makes certain questions possible, and they identify the stakes for pursuing and not pursuing that research. Before we conclude, I want to give a brief list on what to avoid when writing your literature review. I take these largely from conversations I've had with students and conversations I've had with professors about how literature review assignments tend to get misunderstood between these two audiences. First, avoid simply listing the studies that you have read in the order that you have read them. This is probably the number one criticism I hear from professors. Instead, create a conversation across the studies, not a checklist of articles you have read, and then organize the studies based on your new understanding of themes and developments, rather than the chronological order of the publication date. Second, and this is related to the first point, avoid referring to findings as fact or knowledge. We want to consider that previous findings are not necessarily facts, but the findings that were available at that particular time with that particular method. Knowledge in the field is always growing, and new research may challenge previous findings. So keep that window open. Besides, identifying who said what will help you articulate a conversation between scholars. And finally, do not quote from your sources word for word. Except in very rare cases where the way a writer says something is as important or more important than what she actually says, literature reviews should present an analysis through the perspective of the reader, not a list of findings in the author's original voices. Final notes. Take an authoritative stance. This can be difficult because your first couple of literature reviews may be written for classroom assignments. However, once you've read, annotated, categorized and summarized each article into a database of your making, and synthesized your reading into your paper, you can now consider yourself to have some authority on the subject. Take that authoritative stance from the beginning of your paper. Guide the reader through your own reading in a way that makes it easier to recognize the landscape of the field more easily than it was for you when you began reading these primary sources. It may be helpful to think of yourself as a teacher for your readers, whose task it is to explain all that has been written on a subject, why it matters, and what is next to be done. Your review is helping others to understand a complex history of problems in the field, so take the time to explain things patiently and completely as you go through the article. You never know, the way you read the literature and organize it by theme may be different than the way someone else has, and it may contribute and improve their understanding of the field as well. Thank you for coming to the School of Public Health Writing Lab, and for taking a look at this presentation. If you have any other questions about your writing, please don't hesitate to contact me, Brett Griffiths, or Kirsten Harold at the School of Public Health Writing Lab. Our office is in 3838 School of Public Health 1. Turn right at the elevator and follow the sign. We'll be waiting for you there.